They say the cameras never lie, but in Hollywood's golden age, the real drama happened after the director yelled, "Cut." More than a few legendary stars left the set with bruises, grudges, and stories that never made it into the tabloids. What really went on when tempers flared and egos collided just out of sight? Tonight, we dive into the wildest backstage fights. The studio system tried to bury some scars still echo in film history if you know where to look. First, Errol Flynn versus Basil Rathbone. If you thought the duels between Errol Flynn and Basil Rathbone on screen were fierce, the reality behind the scenes was far more dangerous and bloody. The pair first squared off in Captain Blood, 1935, and then again in The Adventures of Robin Hood, 1938, where Hollywood promised audiences the ultimate swashbuckling spectacle. What most fans never knew was just how easily the choreography dissolved into chaos, with razor-sharp steel and raw tempers taking over. Flynn, notorious for his reckless improvisation and devil-may-care attitude, constantly pushed boundaries, demanding that stunt work feel as real as possible. Rathbone, in contrast, was a classically trained fencer who valued precision and safety. This tension built up to a boiling point under the watchful eyes of director Michael Curtis, who famously ordered the actors to remove the protective buttons from their blades to make the action more thrilling for the camera. In one fateful moment, an extra jabbed Flynn so hard that the star stormed off, grabbing Curtis by the throat and growling, "Exciting enough for you?" The most infamous moment came during a take when Rathbone's timing slipped by just milliseconds. Flynn's sharpened sword sliced open Rathbone's thigh, drawing real blood, a wound that nearly ended in catastrophe. While Flynn laughed it off as part of the job, Rathbone later confessed in his memoirs that if Flynn had missed by another inch, he could have run Rathbone straight through. The studio spun the story into box office gold, fueling the legend of Hollywood's most fearless swordsman. But behind closed doors, it changed everything. Studio stunt safety rules were rewritten, insurance premiums soared, and Rathbone added a personal clause in all future contracts, insisting on strict weapon oversight. For audiences, the result was movie magic. For Flynn and Rathbone, it was a bruising reminder that, in classic Hollywood, the line between acting and actual danger was sometimes barely visible. Second, Bette Davis versus Joan Crawford. No feud in Hollywood history is more infamous or more brutal than the war between Bette Davis and Joan Crawford. By the time they shared the screen in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane? In 1962, both actresses were icons fighting for survival in an industry that discarded aging women like last year's gowns. The set quickly transformed into a psychological battlefield where insults, sabotage, and even physical violence became routine. The tension wasn't just for the cameras. Crawford, ever the strategist, allegedly filled her pockets with weights during a scene that required Davis to drag her across the floor, hoping to strain Davis's back. Davis responded in kind, reportedly kicking Crawford so hard during another take that Crawford needed medical attention for a bruised rib. Crew members and extras lived in a state of constant dread, never knowing when the next on-set eruption would happen. Director Robert Aldrich was forced into the role of mediator, trying to keep production from imploding as the two stars waged a cold war in full view of the press. Behind the scenes, things grew darker still. Crawford was said to have sabotaged Davis's Oscar chances, lobbying against her with Academy members. Davis, never one to forgive or forget, retaliated by leaking damaging gossip and publicly mocking Crawford at every opportunity. The feud didn't end with the film. For the rest of their careers, each woman would go out of her way to undermine the other, ensuring that no reconciliation was ever possible. Hollywood, ever hungry for scandal, turned their animosity into a marketing coup. Moviegoers flocked to see two titans locked in mortal combat, unaware that the pain, jealousy, and hatred were all too real. In the end, the film's success became both their triumph and their curse, forever binding their legacies together in a story that was as vicious behind the curtain as it was on screen. 3. Humphrey Bogart versus John Huston. At first glance, the partnership between Humphrey Bogart and director John Huston looked like a match made in Hollywood heaven. They were creative soulmates, teaming up on legendary films like The Maltese Falcon and The African Queen. But beneath the surface, Their collaborations were a powder keg of ego, frustration, and combustible energy. Nowhere was this more apparent than during the grueling shoot for The African Queen, filmed on location in the wilds of Africa. Bogart, the archetypal tough guy, wasn't afraid to challenge authority, even when that authority was his best friend. Huston, notorious for his perfectionism and stubbornness, demanded take after take in brutal heat, expecting nothing short of excellence. The conditions were hellish. Relentless heat, mosquitoes, and contaminated water that left the cast and crew constantly ill. Tempers, already frayed, snapped more than once. In one legendary confrontation, Bogart exploded after hours of failed takes, launching into a profanity-laced tirade at Huston. Huston fired back, neither man backing down as the crew watched, paralyzed, unsure if the fight would turn physical. It was only the shared respect between two larger-than-life personalities that kept things from boiling over into violence. After the dust settled, they'd often share a drink, laughing off the day's battles. Yet, the scars lingered. Crew members whispered about objects thrown in anger, equipment smashed in fits of rage, and days lost to bruised egos. In Hollywood circles, their brawls became the stuff of legend, two titans who could only create greatness through conflict. Ironically, it was this very volatility that fueled their best work. The danger, the chaos, and the threat of a fight at any moment electrified the set and bled onto the screen, giving their films a raw edge that audiences could feel. The brotherhood between Bogart and Huston survived the ordeal, but only because both men understood the cost of genius. Sometimes, you had to go to war with your own friends. Fourth, Miriam Hopkins versus Bette Davis. In an industry obsessed with youth and beauty, nothing fueled resentment like competing for the same spotlight. For Miriam Hopkins and Bette Davis, that rivalry became all-consuming when they starred together in Old Acquaintance 1943. Hopkins, once the bigger star, felt threatened by Davis's meteoric rise and made no secret of her contempt. The result? A backstage feud so bitter and relentless that it overshadowed the film itself. Hopkins, never one to back down, would openly taunt Davis between takes, goading her with snide remarks about her looks and talent. Davis, for her part, refused to be bullied, responding with icy glares and withering put-downs. The animosity peaked during a now legendary scene in which Hopkins, in character, violently shook Davis. The camera captured more than acting. Davis retaliated by slapping Hopkins across the face so hard that the sound echoed through the studio. The slap was real, and so was the rage. Crew members dreaded working days with both actresses as the tension infected every corner of the set. Rehearsals became battlegrounds where lines blurred between fiction and reality, and every scene threatened to spiral out of control. Director Vincent Sherman, desperate to keep the production afloat, was forced to stage scenes with body doubles or keep the stars separated for hours at a time. The press feasted on rumors of fistfights and sabotage, while Warner Brothers executives quietly despaired at the escalating costs. In private, both women admitted the feud fueled their best performances, each determined to outshine the other at any cost. For Hollywood, it was the perfect storm. Two titans, locked in battle, creating on-screen magic, fueled by off-screen animosity. Decades later, their rivalry remains a masterclass in how ego, ambition, and insecurity can turn a simple movie shoot into an all-out war. 5. Laurence Olivier versus Marilyn Monroe. When Laurence Olivier, England's most celebrated actor, agreed to direct and co-star with Marilyn Monroe in The Prince and the Showgirl, 1957, Hollywood expected cinematic fireworks, but nobody anticipated the kind that exploded behind the scenes. Monroe was already a superstar, but her insecurity, lateness, and method of acting infuriated the classically trained Olivier, who craved order and discipline. From the first day of rehearsal, their relationship was a disaster in the making. Olivier, accustomed to English stage tradition, wanted everything by the book. Monroe, haunted by personal demons and reliant on acting coach Paula Strasberg, ignored Olivier's direction and followed her own instincts, no matter how many takes it took. Their creative clash quickly turned personal. Monroe accused Olivier of being cold and condescending. Olivier called Monroe unprofessional and childlike. According to crew members, shouting matches erupted on set, with Monroe breaking down in tears and Olivier storming off in a fury. The production quickly devolved into a war zone. Monroe's chronic lateness drove Olivier to distraction, leading to hours of lost filming and ballooning costs. At one point, Olivier was so frustrated, he delivered lines in a deliberately flat, mocking tone, hoping to get a rise out of Monroe. Instead, she froze, requiring another 20 takes to recover. Some days, shooting would grind to a halt altogether, with the crew left waiting as the two stars waged psychological warfare in their dressing rooms. The result was a movie filled with awkward chemistry, but also moments of unexpected brilliance, a testament to how conflict, even at its ugliest, can create unforgettable art. For Monroe, the experience was so traumatic that she vowed never to work with Olivier again. For Olivier, it was a harsh lesson in the unpredictability of American stardom. For Hollywood, The Prince and the Showgirl stands as a cautionary tale. Behind the glamour and the marquee names, the wildest fights are often the ones you never see. 6. Greta Garbo versus Ruben Mamoulian. Greta Garbo's icy mystique was legendary, but her backstage battles with director Ruben Mamoulian on Queen Christina 1933 nearly shattered that porcelain image. Garbo, a silent film superstar transitioning into talkies, was as meticulous as she was mercurial. Mamoulian, meanwhile, was a filmmaker obsessed with perfecting every detail. When their visions clashed, it was not merely a disagreement, it was a Hollywood earthquake. It began with creative differences. Garbo had strong opinions about every shot, from lighting to line delivery. She'd arrived on set, prepared to play Christina as both vulnerable and commanding, but Mamoulian saw her as a symbol, a stoic monarch, cool and untouchable. Garbo argued for more humanity, Mamoulian for more distance. Their arguments were so heated that crew members would flinch at the sound of their voices echoing down the studio corridors. The real flashpoint came halfway through production. Garbo, exhausted after a day of grueling retakes, exploded at Mamoulian over his insistence on yet another close-up. She stormed off set, threatening to quit the film entirely unless the director relented. Mamoulian, refusing to be bullied, called her bluff and announced to the studio heads that he was willing to walk as well. For 2 tense days, production ground to a halt, with studio bosses frantically negotiating a truce. Ultimately, neither star nor director blinked. Garbo returned, but on her own terms, demanding final say over certain scenes and threatening to bring in her own camera operator if Mamoulian wouldn't cooperate. Mamoulian, faced with losing his star in his film, begrudgingly agreed, yet their working relationship never recovered. Despite the tension, Queen Christina became a cinematic triumph, with Garbo's performance hailed as one of her finest. Still, those who worked on the film never forgot the off-screen drama. Years later, Mamoulian would admit that directing Garbo was both the greatest challenge and the greatest torment of his career. Their battle behind the scenes was as dramatic as anything captured on celluloid, an epic clash between two perfectionists, both determined to rule. 7. Frank Sinatra versus Joseph L. Mankiewicz. Frank Sinatra was not a man known for patience. By the time he joined the cast of Guys and Dolls 1955, he was already the chairman of the board, a superstar with little tolerance for anything or anyone that stood in his way. Joseph L. Mankiewicz, an acclaimed director, had his own reputation for exacting standards and long hours on set. When these two titans collided, the fallout was as loud as it was legendary. Tension simmered from the start. Sinatra desperately wanted the lead role of Sky Masterson, but Mankiewicz cast Marlon Brando instead, relegating Sinatra to the part of Nathan Detroit. Sinatra never forgave the slight. He made his displeasure known, frequently clashing with Mankiewicz over everything from dialogue changes to shooting schedules. Crew members described the atmosphere as walking on eggshells. One wrong word, and Sinatra's temper would erupt. One particularly explosive argument erupted over a musical number. Sinatra, who prided himself on his vocal prowess, insisted on recording live on set, while Mankiewicz wanted to use pre-recorded tracks for better sound quality. Their shouting match could be heard through closed studio doors. In a fit of rage, Sinatra reportedly hurled a chair across the dressing room, narrowly missing a crew member. Filming ground to a halt until tempers cooled. Sinatra's simmering resentment manifested in other ways. He began showing up late to set, refusing to rehearse, and at one point locked himself in his dressing room for hours, refusing to come out unless his demands were met. Mankiewicz, for his part, refused to be bullied, threatening to replace Sinatra if he didn't cooperate. Despite the constant friction, Guys and Dolls became a major success, but for those behind the scenes, the memory of Sinatra's volatile outbursts and Mankiewicz's unyielding direction left scars. For the rest of his career, Sinatra insisted on creative control, vowing never again to let a director call the tune. Their backstage battle remains one of classic Hollywood's most notorious showdowns, a clash between artistic vision and ego, with the entire set caught in the crossfire. 8. Orson Welles versus John Houseman. The partnership between Orson Welles and producer John Houseman was the stuff of theatrical legend, birthing the Mercury Theater and revolutionizing American film with Citizen Kane, 1941. But this creative marriage didn't just produce masterpieces. It sparked some of the wildest backstage brawls Hollywood had ever seen. At the heart of their conflict was Welles's perfectionism and Houseman's need for control. Welles was a young prodigy, convinced of his own genius and unafraid to bulldoze anyone in his way. Houseman, equally talented but more pragmatic, was tasked with reining in Welles's wild ambitions and keeping the budget in check. Their working relationship was famously tempestuous, filled with late-night arguments, slammed doors, and epic shouting matches. The most notorious confrontation erupted during a late-night editing session on Citizen Kane. Welles, unhappy with the studio's notes, demanded that Houseman back him unconditionally. Houseman, tired and frustrated, refused, leading to a furious exchange that saw Welles smash a lamp, throw scripts against the wall, and threaten to end their partnership on the spot. Crew members huddled outside, listening to the chaos and waiting to see if they'd have jobs the next morning. The fight ended with both men storming out into the night, only to return hours later, exhausted but ready to finish the film. Their partnership didn't survive much longer. Houseman quit, citing Welles's impossible demands and volcanic temper. The fallout rippled through Hollywood, with studio executives whispering about the dangers of unchecked genius. Though Citizen Kane became a landmark in cinema history, insiders never forgot the war behind the scenes. Welles and Houseman's clashes became cautionary tales, proof that sometimes the greatest art is born out of conflict, but the cost can be lifelong enmity. Their battles left a legacy not just on film, but in the lore of classic Hollywood's wildest fights. 9. Maureen O'Hara versus John Ford. When Maureen O'Hara stepped onto a John Ford set, it was like lighting a fuse in a dynamite factory. Ford, a director famed for his genius and his bullying, met his match in the fiery Irish actress. Their clashes during films like The Quiet Man, 1952, were legendary for their intensity, and neither was willing to back down. Ford's directing style was notorious. He'd berate actors in front of the entire crew, bark contradictory orders, and push his stars to the breaking point to extract the performances he wanted. Most actors endured his tirades in silence, but not O'Hara. She met Ford's rants head-on, shouting back in defense of herself and her fellow actors. The set became a battleground of wills, with crew members nervously watching each new confrontation escalate. One incident during The Quiet Man became Hollywood folklore. Ford demanded that O'Hara perform a dangerous stunt herself, being dragged through a muddy field by a runaway carriage. When she objected, Ford exploded in anger. O'Hara stood her ground, telling Ford in front of the whole crew that if he wanted the shot, he'd have to do it himself. The standoff ended only when Ford grudgingly relented, muttering under his breath but secretly impressed by her courage. Their professional relationship was fraught with tension, but also respect. O'Hara later admitted that Ford's bullying made her a stronger actress, while Ford privately told friends that O'Hara was the only actress who could ever out-stubborn him. Their battles were loud, public, and sometimes bruising, but they never lost respect for each other. For classic Hollywood, the O'Hara-Ford fights symbolized a changing era, a time when actresses no longer had to submit to the whims of powerful men. Their clashes set a precedent for generations of stars who would demand respect on set, no matter the cost. 10th Clark Gable versus George Cukor. Clark Gable's reputation as the King of Hollywood wasn't just built on charm, it was also forged in fire, as proven by his backstage battles with director George Cukor during the making of Gone with the Wind, 1939. Gable, cast as the iconic Rhett Butler, clashed almost immediately with Cukor's meticulous directing style, which he felt was too focused on the female leads and not on his own role. From the start, Gable made it clear he didn't like Cukor's approach, which involved extensive rehearsals and an emphasis on emotional subtlety. Used to directors who catered to his preferences, Gable bristled at being treated like just another member of the cast. Tensions boiled over when Gable confronted Cukor about a scene he felt made him look weak. The confrontation escalated quickly, with Gable reportedly raising his voice and threatening to walk off the picture unless Cukor was replaced. Producer David O. Selznick was left with an impossible choice: side with his star or his director. After days of negotiations, Cukor was quietly fired from the project, replaced by Victor Fleming, who happened to be a close friend of Gable's. The transition was handled delicately for the press, but those on set knew the truth. Gable had forced the studio's hand, and the director's chair was the price. The incident left a lasting mark on Hollywood. Cukor, one of the industry's most respected directors, was shaken by the dismissal, but never spoke publicly against Gable. For Gable, the victory cemented his image as an untouchable star who got his way, no matter the collateral damage. The story of their backstage fight remains a testament to the immense power wielded by classic Hollywood's leading men and the steep price of standing in their way. Ava Gardner versus Howard Hughes. Ava Gardner and Howard Hughes were a Hollywood power couple whose passion was as combustible off-screen as it was alluring in gossip columns. Their relationship, which spanned the late 1940s and early 1950s, quickly escalated from romance to an all-out backstage war, often spilling onto film sets and leaving entire productions on edge. Gardner, a North Carolina beauty with a fiery temper and a refusal to play second fiddle to any man, found herself swept up by Hughes' wealth, charisma, and infamously controlling nature. But Hughes, a studio tycoon and aviation magnate, was used to dictating terms on his movies and in his private life. When Gardner pushed back, it set off legendary shouting matches that could be heard echoing through studio sound stages. Friends and staff recalled nights when furniture was smashed and threats were screamed, with neither willing to give an inch. Gardner, never one to be intimidated, would throw whatever was at hand, including glass ashtrays, at Hughes. He'd respond in kind, punching holes in walls or calling security to physically remove her from his property. Their volatility didn't stop at home. During the filming of Mogambo, Gardner's moods would swing wildly after a confrontation with Hughes, leading to days when she'd show up late or refuse to work altogether. The crew grew used to seeing her in tears or fuming with anger, while phone calls from Hughes, sometimes dozens in a single day, would interrupt takes and bring production to a standstill. On more than one occasion, Gardner's bruises were explained away as accidents on set, but insiders knew better. Despite, or perhaps because of, the drama, both their legends grew. Gardner's screen presence sizzled with a dangerous edge, while Hughes cultivated a reputation as a man who couldn't be tamed, even by the wildest woman in Hollywood. Their relationship eventually ended in chaos, but their backstage battles became a blueprint for the kind of messy, headline-grabbing Hollywood love stories that would echo for decades. For all their glamour, what happened behind closed doors was a raw, sometimes frightening display of the price paid for living life at full volume. 12th, Olivier de Havilland versus Joan Fontaine. The feud between sisters. Olivier de Havilland and Joan Fontaine was one of Hollywood's most enduring and explosive family dramas. Both were Oscar-winning actresses, and both were fiercely competitive, but their rivalry was more than sibling jealousy. It erupted backstage at the 1942 Academy Awards in a physical confrontation witnessed by the crème de la crème of classic Hollywood. Tensions had simmered for years. Growing up in the same household, de Havilland and Fontaine fought for attention and approval, a competition that only intensified once they both found fame in Hollywood. By the time Fontaine was nominated for Suspicion and de Havilland for Hold Back the Dawn at the same Oscar ceremony, The rivalry had reached its boiling point. When Fontaine's name was announced as Best Actress, de Havilland's congratulatory embrace looked warm for the cameras, but eyewitnesses claimed Fontaine's arm was gripped so tightly she winced in pain. Later that night, backstage, the sisters exchanged harsh words that quickly devolved into a physical struggle. De Havilland allegedly grabbed Fontaine by the arm and yanked her out of a congratulatory circle, spitting out an insult overheard by several startled onlookers. The altercation was quickly broken up by studio handlers, but the damage was done. Hollywood's Golden Sisters were now infamous for their very public, very bitter enmity. The feud spilt into press interviews, family events, and future award seasons, with both women refusing to appear together in photographs and often refusing to even speak one another's name. The intensity of their rivalry became legend, inspiring countless articles and even a television miniseries decades later. In Hollywood, the de Havilland-Fontaine Oscars brawl stood as proof that the most dramatic fights weren't always between leading men and directors. Sometimes they unfolded between sisters, in full view of the world, with reputations, careers, and family bonds forever fractured. 13. James Cagney versus Jack Warner. In the era of studio moguls, few actors dared to challenge the boss, but James Cagney, Hollywood's original tough guy, was no ordinary star, and Jack Warner, head of Warner Brothers, was no ordinary executive. Their battles over contracts, pay, and creative control became notorious across Hollywood, but one particular confrontation on the Warner lot became the stuff of legend. Cagney was known for his explosive temper and unyielding sense of justice. He'd already walked out on Warner Brothers once, suing the studio for breach of contract and winning, an unprecedented act at the time. The final straw came in the late 1930s when Cagney discovered Warner was selling films overseas at discounted rates to avoid paying stars for their share of profits. Enraged, Cagney stormed into Jack Warner's office with no appointment, no lawyer, just a copy of his contract and a clenched fist. Witnesses recalled shouting that could be heard throughout the building as Cagney accused Warner of cheating his actors and demanded better pay, working conditions, and creative freedom. At one point, the altercation grew so heated that Cagney, red-faced and shaking, slammed his fist on Warner's desk, hard enough to crack the glass in its frame. Warner, never one to back down, threatened to blacklist Cagney from every major studio in town. Cagney responded by daring him to try, swearing he'd take every secret to the newspapers. For hours, the two titans faced off, neither willing to blink. In the end, Warner relented, giving Cagney unprecedented creative latitude and a much-improved contract. The incident spread quickly, making Cagney a hero to rank-and-file actors and marking a turning point in the studio system's iron grip on its stars. For Cagney, it was a victory not just for himself, but for every actor tired of the studio's bullying. Their fight was about respect, power, and changing Hollywood itself, and everyone who worked on the lot knew it. 14. George Raft versus studio executives. George Raft, the tough-talking, smooth-moving actor whose gangster roles defined an era, brought more than just charisma to the screen. He brought a real-life reputation that terrified studio executives. Raft's off-screen connections to organized crime weren't just rumors, and he made sure everyone knew it. Whenever negotiations soured, tempers flared, or a director pushed him too far, Raft would remind them with chilling calm that he had friends who could solve problems. The most famous showdown came during the production of Each Dawn I Die, 1939. Raft, unhappy with the script and his screen time, stormed into a meeting with executives at Warner Brothers, flanked by two intimidating friends. The executives, expecting a standard argument, were stunned when Raft openly threatened to walk unless his demands were met and, if rumors are to be believed, implied there could be consequences beyond just recasting. Eyewitnesses described the scene as tense and surreal. Raft, sitting with his arms crossed and voice ice cold, spelt out exactly what he wanted: more lines, a better contract, and the power to approve his own directors. The executives, caught between a star and a potential scandal, reluctantly agreed to his demands. On set, Raft wielded his new power like a weapon, dictating shots, changing lines, and freezing out co-stars who challenged him. Raft's methods set a dangerous precedent, emboldening other actors to challenge the system and frightening studio bosses into handling him with kid gloves. For years, producers whispered about Raft's ability to make things happen, and no one wanted to find out what would happen if they pushed him too far. His legendary fights with executives remain a reminder that in old Hollywood, the biggest threats weren't always just about contracts. They could be personal, dangerous, and sometimes criminal. 15. Montgomery Clift versus Fred Zinnemann. Montgomery Clift was one of the most gifted and tortured actors of his generation, known for his vulnerability to screen and his relentless pursuit of perfection behind it. When he teamed with director Fred Zinnemann on From Here to Eternity 1953, sparks were inevitable. Zinnemann, a methodical craftsman with little patience for emotional volatility, soon found himself locked in battle with Clift's exacting standards. Clift agonized over every scene, insisting on dozens of takes and arguing over the smallest nuances of his character. Zinnemann, determined to keep the film on schedule, pushed back, demanding that Clift trust his direction and stick to the script. The mounting tension exploded during a pivotal scene when Clift, convinced he was being shortchanged emotionally, refused to perform until Zinnemann rewrote several lines. The standoff brought shooting to a halt. Crew members described the fight as excruciating. Clift, usually soft-spoken, erupted in frustration, shouting at Zinnemann in front of the entire cast and crew. Zinnemann, not one to be bullied, shouted back, threatening to cut Clift's scenes entirely if he didn't cooperate. For hours, the two men argued, sometimes inches apart, voices raised, tempers flaring. It was a battle of wills, with the fate of the film hanging in the balance. Ultimately, a tense truce was brokered by co-star Burt Lancaster, who managed to mediate between the two egos. The production limped forward, but the scars lingered. Clift and Zinnemann never worked together again, and insiders agreed that both men emerged bruised, professionally and personally. Still, From Here to Eternity became a classic, in no small part because of the intensity the clash brought to the screen. Their backstage fight stands as a reminder that sometimes the greatest performances come at the highest price, paid not just in effort, but in raw, honest conflict. 16. Stuart Granger versus Mel Ferrer. On the set of MGM's lavish 1952 adventure, Scaramouche, Stuart Granger and Mel Ferrer weren't just pretending to duel, they were putting themselves through one of the most grueling, physically punishing fight scenes in Hollywood history. Billed as the longest sword fight ever filmed, the production demanded that Granger and Ferrer engage in a non-stop ballet of blades for more than 8 minutes of screen time. What wasn't scripted was the trail of blood and bruises the duel left behind. Director George Sidney's vision was for authenticity, real steel, real sweat, and real danger. But neither Granger nor Ferrer was fully prepared for the toll this would take. The fight scene, sprawling across opera boxes, staircases, and chandeliers, was shot in exhausting 10-second increments. Day after day, both men would collapse off camera, hands blistered and nerves frayed, only to wrap their wounds and start again. By the third day, Ferrer's fencing glove had split, exposing his skin to Granger's blade. A mistimed parry left Ferrer's knuckles sliced open, blood dripping onto the marble set. For the cast and crew, it became a kind of ritual, tending to injuries, then pushing on in the name of cinematic glory. Granger later joked to reporters, "If I'd known it would be this real, I'd have stuck to love scenes." Ferrer, nursing his wounds, admitted that the adrenaline and rivalry kept him going, even as his body screamed for rest. The duel's realism, fueled by this behind-the-scenes brutality, helped catapult Scaramouche to box office success and change the course of both actors' careers. Granger was redeemed from a string of forgettable romances, and Ferrer found himself in demand for more serious, dramatic roles. Yet, both men confessed that no choreographed fight ever felt safe again. Every clang of blade in later projects echoed with the memory of real pain, and every director who suggested a bit more realism was met with a knowing glance. In classic Hollywood, even stage combat could leave lasting scars on bodies, reputations, and in the annals of movie lore. 17th, Errol Flynn versus Anthony Quinn. By 1952, Errol Flynn's reputation for wild living and on-set unpredictability was already legend. but during the making of Universal's pirate epic Against All Flags, he met his match in the form of the fiery Anthony Quinn. Their backstage rivalry, rooted in ego and a shared refusal to play it safe, resulted in one of the era's most infamous dueling disasters, one that nearly cost Flynn his eye and forever altered both men's careers. Both Flynn and Quinn insisted on using live, sharp blades for their climactic deck-top duel, arguing that anything less was an insult to the pirate tradition. The director's warnings were ignored, the studio's new safety policies quietly sidestepped. On the day of the big fight, tempers flared and choreography unraveled. Flynn, improvising for the camera, lunged off-script, ripping Quinn's doublet. Quinn, not to be outdone, answered with a furious riposte, his sword slicing through Flynn's costume and nicking his eyelid, stopping a breath from Flynn's eye. The set froze. For a moment, no one knew if Flynn had been blinded. He staggered, blood in his vision, then burst into laughter, slapping Quinn on the back and demanding another take before he was ushered off for stitches. Studio publicists pounced, transforming near tragedy into front-page legend. Photos of Flynn's bandaged brow graced fan magazines under headlines like "Too Wild to Tame." For Flynn, the incident revived a flagging career and restored his swashbuckling image. For Quinn, it was a springboard into prestige dramatic roles and a farewell to dangerous fencing stunts. Universal, in the aftermath, instituted its first written no live points policy for all future productions. Yet, as long as there were egos to be matched and legends to be made, Hollywood's most volatile stars would find new ways to turn performance into peril. 18. Maureen O'Hara versus Robert Douglas. Long before women were widely accepted as action stars, Maureen O'Hara blazed her own trail and left a little blood in her wake. On the set of At Sword's Point, shot in 1949, released 1952, O'Hara insisted on doing her own stunts and fencing sequences, determined to prove she could match any man in Hollywood, blade for blade. Her co-star, Robert Douglas, learned just how far she was willing to go in a duel that became famous for an accidental but very real injury. For 6 weeks, O'Hara trained dawn to dusk with fencing master Fred Cavins, earning the nickname Pirate Queen among the crew. She swung her sword with such conviction that even studio veterans took notice. During the shoot's pivotal throne room fight, O'Hara's rapier slipped a parry and hissed past Douglas's cheek, slicing off a silver epaulette and drawing a thin line of blood. Douglas, ever the professional, stayed in character as a sneering villain, even as blood trickled down his face. Only when the director yelled, "Cut!" did the tension break, the crew erupting in half applause, half panic. O'Hara was mortified, dropping her sword and rushing to Douglas's side to apologize, in Gaelic no less. Rather than stop production, the director rolled cameras into her genuine tears, using the footage for a close-up in the final cut. The story hit the press, and ticket sales soared, with headlines proclaiming O'Hara as Hollywood's first true female action star. Insurance rates on her future films skyrocketed, but so did her asking price. For generations of stuntwomen, O'Hara's razor-thin miss became a legend, the moment Hollywood realized that women could not only headline a swashbuckler, they could do it without a double, and all it took was a single, perfectly placed cut. 19th, Tyrone Power versus George Sanders. Solomon and Sheba. 1959 would be Tyrone Power's final film, a project already burdened by high expectations and grueling conditions. But no one anticipated that the sword fight between Power and co-star George Sanders would become a literal duel, with death looming over every stroke. Filming took place in the blistering heat of Madrid, with both stars wearing heavy bronze armor and wielding real 16-pound broadswords. Power, nursing chest pains he chalked up to exhaustion, insisted on authenticity, swinging the same steel he'd used since his swashbuckling days as Zorro. Sanders, ever the perfectionist, matched him step for step. On the 12th take of a particularly fierce exchange, Power slipped on a loose plank. Sanders' sword clanged off Power's helmet, and for a split second, it seemed the action had gone catastrophically wrong. Power laughed off the mishap and pushed through another take. But just minutes later, after a final flourish, he went pale and collapsed beside the prop altar, dead from a massive heart attack. The set was thrown into chaos, Filming was immediately halted, scripts were hastily rewritten, and Yul Brynner was brought in as a replacement. But the footage of Power's final fight became legendary, with fans flocking to see the duel that killed Hollywood's prince. For Sanders, the tragedy was haunting. He refused to ever fence on screen again, later describing the experience as the moment make-believe became too real to bear. For Hollywood, it was a sobering lesson at the risk of pushing stars and realism too far. Power's last battle left a mark that would echo through the industry, a reminder that some fights cost more than applause. 20. Danny Kaye versus Basil Rathbone. Not all of Hollywood's wildest backstage fights were fueled by rivalry or rage. Sometimes, it was pure ambition and precision that turned a scene into a real duel. On the set of The Court Jester, 1955, Danny Kaye, known for his comedic timing and lightning-fast footwork, was determined to prove he could match the great Basil Rathbone, widely hailed as Hollywood's finest fencer. Rathbone, 63 and expecting a light-hearted spoof, was stunned by Kaye's commitment. Under the tutelage of Olympic coach Ralph Faulkner, Kaye drilled for weeks until his reflexes rivaled those of the best. Cameras rolled on a sequence that quickly escalated. No stunt doubles, no rubber swords, just real steel and blinding speed. Halfway through filming, Kaye's blade flicked so fast that the cinematographer upped the frame rate, capturing every hit and near miss. It wasn't long before the comedy took a turn. During one take, Kaye's sword slipped past Rathbone's guard, splitting the veteran actor's sleeve and leaving a thin line of blood on his wrist. Rathbone, ever the professional, finished the scene, his eyes flashing with genuine fury behind the comedic facade. The take made the final cut, and publicists spun the accident into a testament to Kaye's unexpected prowess. Critics later hailed the sequence as the funniest and most electrifying sword fight ever captured in film. For Rathbone, it was a swan song, his final great duel. For Kaye, it was the moment he was recognized not just as a clown, but as an artist capable of matching legends. For audiences, the result was pure movie magic, but for those on set, it was a lesson in just how thin the line between slapstick and scar tissue could be. In classic Hollywood, the battles weren't always on the silver screen. Sometimes, the wildest fights happened just out of frame, where ego, ambition, and pride left scars no camera could capture. These backstage brawls shaped careers, ruined friendships, and rewrote the rules of movie making itself. The next time you watch a Golden Age epic, remember, every frame is haunted by real tension, real danger, and legends who bled for their craft. In Hollywood, the fiercest duels were always the ones the world was never meant to see.